The movers were already boxing up my life when I stepped out of the rideshare, and the worst part was the sunlight. It was bright, ordinary, almost cheerful, as if the world had decided there was nothing strange about finding your home being sold out from under you. For one suspended second, I truly believed there had to be some mistake. 3 men in navy work shirts stood on the sidewalk outside my building, leaning against towers of cardboard boxes, and at first my mind reached for every explanation except the real one. Maybe someone on another floor was moving out. Maybe a neighbor had borrowed one of my old markers. Maybe those weren't my boxes, even though my own handwriting stared back at me from the side of a carton labeled winter coats. My suitcase was still by my feet from the airport, a little crooked from the trip back from Hawaii, and the wheels looked absurdly clean against the city grit. Then one of the movers straightened, glanced at the clipboard in his hand, and asked, "Are you Claire Bennett?" The words did not land all at once. They hit in fragments, sharp and unreal. Clear out. New owner. This afternoon, I just stood there, staring at him while the noise of the street seemed to muffle around me, as if the city had suddenly been pushed underwater. My penthouse, my home, the place I had dairy. I just stood there, staring at him while the noise of the street seemed to muffle around me, as if the city had suddenly been pushed underwater. My penthouse, my home, the place I had paid for with long nights, early mornings, promotions earned the hard way, and years of telling myself that if I just kept going, if I just worked harder, I would one day have something that belonged only to me. The message beneath it made my vision blur for a second. Don't be dramatic. It's done. We helped your sister. Stop acting like you're the only one who matters. You can figure out where to sister. Stop acting like you're the only one who matters. You can figure out where to stay tonight. A second text followed almost immediately, this one from Sophie. Welcome to the real world, homeless girl. I read both messages twice because part of me still refused to believe that cruelty could arrive so neatly typed, so light in tone, so confident in its own righteousness. I swallowed hard and asked the mover, as calmly as I could, "Could you give me a minute?" He nodded with a kind of worn sympathy and said, "Take your time. This is a rough one." If only he knew. I stepped away from the truck, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone, and dialed my mother. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting with the phone in her hand, and before I could say a word she snapped, "You there yet? Good, saves me the trouble of explaining." Her voice had that clipped, irritated edge it always got when she had already decided she was right. I stared up at the building where I had lived for 4 years and whispered, "Mom, what did you do?" She exhaled in a rush, offended by my tone more than my question. "What we had to do," she said. Sophie was drowning. She couldn't pay her debts. Things were getting dangerous. You, with your high salary and your perfect little life, could afford to do something. "You sold my home," I said, and even to my own ears I sounded distant, like someone narrating a nightmare from the far side of it. She gave a short scoff. "Oh, please. What do you need a penthouse for? You're one person. Your sister is trying to build a life. She needs stability." The irony was so brutal it almost made me laugh. Sophie, at 28, had never built anything in her life except a trail of excuses and emergency rescues. "I never agreed to this," I said, more firmly now. "Not once." "That's why we used the document you signed years ago," my mother replied, as if she were discussing a grocery receipt. Thank God we still had it, or Sophie would have been ruined. I went cold all over. "What document?" I asked, though some instinct inside me already knew. "That power of attorney thing from after your surgery," she said. "You were, what, 23? We updated it a while ago." I pressed a hand to my forehead. "That was for medical emergencies," I said slowly. "Medical decisions. It had nothing to do with my property." She made a dismissive sound, the same one she'd used my whole life any time my feelings became inconvenient. "You always overreact, Claire. Honestly, I'm tired of the drama." Then my father's voice cut in, muffled at first, then clearer as she put him on speaker. "Listen to your mother," he said. "This is for the good of the family." I closed my eyes as the heat of the afternoon pressed against my skin and realized, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that none of them believed they had done anything wrong. My father's voice stayed calm in that cold, practiced way he used whenever he wanted to sound reasonable, while saying something unreasonable. "You'll land on your feet," he added, as if that settled everything, as if the fact that I had always recovered from every problem meant they could create as many problems as they liked. That I had always recovered from every problem meant they could create as many problems as they liked. That had always been the family logic. I was the capable one, the one who worked harder, planned better, fixed things when they broke. Sophie was the fragile one, the storm everyone else had to organize around. "Where is she?" I asked quietly, though I could already hear movement behind them on the line. Before either of my parents answered, my sister's voice slipped into the call, light and almost amused. "Right here," Sophie said, sounding so unconcerned that my stomach twisted. "And honestly, Claire," Sophie said, sounding so unconcerned that my stomach twisted. "And honestly, Claire, you should be thanking us." My jaw tightened. "Thanking you," I repeated slowly. "Yes," she continued, and now her tone was full of the same self-pity she had perfected since childhood. "If I went bankrupt, it would have ruined everything for all of us. This helped everyone, including you. You're too young to be tied to one place anyway. Travel more. Work from different neighborhoods. It'll be good for you." Something inside me shifted then, not a break but a crack that let light through. For years I had told myself that Sophie was careless but not malicious, that my parents were controlling but ultimately loving. Standing there on the sidewalk watching strangers pack away my life, that illusion collapsed with a quiet, decisive snap. "So you all just decided my life didn't matter," I said. My mother sighed in irritation. "We are your parents," she said sharply. "We know what's best for you." I stared at the pavement and remembered hearing that sentence at 16 when they insisted I attend the college they chose, at 22 when they discouraged the job I wanted, and again at 25 when I refused to lend Sophie $5,000 she never intended to repay. The phrase had always been their trump card. Authority disguised as love. "You'll be fine," my father repeated. "Just stop being dramatic." That word again, tossed like a blanket meant to smother everything uncomfortable. I looked back at the movers lifting another box into the truck and said carefully, "You didn't sell what you think you sold." There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could imagine them glancing at each other in confusion. My father scoffed. "What does that even mean?" Sophie said impatiently, "Claire, just say whatever weird point you're trying to make." I felt an odd calm settle into my chest. "You'll find out soon enough," I said. "Find out what?" Sophie demanded. "Not today," I replied, and before they could answer I ended the call. For a moment I stood there while the street noise rushed back around me. Cars passed. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The sun burned the back of my neck. It all felt strangely ordinary for a moment that had just detonated my life. When I walked back toward the movers, the foreman gave me a sympathetic look. "Where do you want everything?" he asked. I glanced up at the glass balconies of the building that had once been mine and said, "Storage. Just put it all in storage." He nodded. "You got it." As they continued loading the truck, I stepped aside and opened my contacts. My thumb hovered for a moment over a name I hadn't called in years, Victoria Hayes, attorney. When she answered, her voice was brisk but warm. "Claire Bennett," she said after I introduced myself. "It's been a while." I took a breath that felt like the first real breath I had taken since leaving Hawaii and said quietly, "My parents sold my penthouse while I was on vacation. I think they used a forged document to do it." There was a pause, then her voice hardened into something razor-sharp. "Do not speak to them again," she said immediately. "Not one word. Send me every document you have, and I'll start pulling the trust records." The steadiness in her tone grounded me more than anything else had that afternoon. "Good," I whispered, "because they have no idea what they've started." By the time the truck doors slammed shut, the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky. I watched it drive away, carrying everything I owned, and realized that my life had been divided into two parts with terrifying efficiency, before this afternoon and after it. That night, I checked into the cheapest motel within walking distance of Victoria's office. The room smelled faintly of bleach and synthetic air freshener, and when I closed the door behind me, the echo made the space feel even smaller. I locked the door twice and leaned against it until my pulse slowed. The bedspread was stiff and the wallpaper peeled at the edges, but exhaustion finally pushed me to sit down. My suitcase lay half open on the floor, Hawaiian sand still clinging faintly to the wheels. Somewhere inside that bag was the last version of my life before everything had changed. Instead of unpacking, I reached for my laptop. If my parents thought they had taken everything from me, I needed to know exactly how wrong they were. I opened the secure digital vault where I stored copies of every major document in my life, the habit of a person who had learned early that stability sometimes depended on preparation. The password screen glowed against the dim motel light, and for a moment my hands trembled over the keyboard before the files appeared. The trust documents sat there exactly where Victoria had told me to keep them years earlier, untouched since my mid-20s. I clicked the first file open and began reading slowly, untouched since my mid-20s. I clicked the first file open and began reading slowly, forcing myself to absorb each line instead of skimming past it the way I might have before. The legal language felt dense at first, but then the meaning sharpened with sudden clarity. The penthouse was not just mine in spirit or by mortgage payments. It was mine by law. The property had been transferred to me as the beneficiary of a family trust years ago, and the document stated plainly that any liquidation of the asset required my written approval and co-signature. There it was, unmistakable, printed in black and white. No matter what my parents believed, they had never possessed the authority to sell it. A strange mixture of relief and fury twisted through me. They had not just betrayed me, they had assumed they could do it without consequences. I leaned back against the headboard, letting the truth settle into place piece by piece. They hadn't even bothered verifying the legality because, historically, they had never needed to. When they demanded something, I had always bent eventually. The phone buzzed beside me, a text from Victoria. Call when ready. When they demanded something, I had always bent eventually. The phone buzzed beside me, a text from Victoria. Call when ready. I dialed immediately. She answered on the first ring and spoke before I could. I've reviewed the trust documents, she said. Legally, the penthouse is yours. But Claire, this is going to get worse before it gets better. I pressed my fingers against my temples. They can't keep the sale, right? They can't keep the sale, right? They can't keep the money. No, she replied firmly. But they've already misrepresented facts to the buyers and likely committed fraud signing documents without you. Possibly forgery as well. We'll need evidence before filing anything formal. The calm precision in her voice felt like a lifeline in a storm. What do I do tonight? I asked. Rest if you can, she said. Tomorrow morning we start building the case. Andrew Clare, do not respond to your family. After the call, I closed the laptop and lay staring at the cracked ceiling, while the hum of the motel refrigerator filled the silence. My mind kept replaying old memories in painful contrast with the present. Birthdays where Sophie clung to me for help, road trips where my parents sang along to the radio, evenings in the kitchen when laughter felt effortless and real. I tried to fit those moments beside what they had done to me, but the pieces refused to align. Maybe the family I believed in had always been partly imagined. Maybe I had simply been too loyal to see the pattern forming. A sharp knock at the door startled me upright. 3 quick raps echoed through the room. My first instinct was panic, but when I cracked the door a few inches, a motel clerk stood there holding a brown envelope. Someone dropped this off for you, she said apologetically. They said it was urgent. I shut the door and sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope resting in my lap. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, imagining every possibility inside. Finally, I tore it open. A single sheet of paper slid out. My name was written across the top in handwriting I recognized instantly. Beneath it was a short message scrawled in the same familiar script. You should have done more to house the top in handwriting I recognized instantly. Beneath it was a short message scrawled in the same familiar script. "You should have done more to help your sister. You left us no choice." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. My mother had always written her capital letters with that same aggressive tilt. My phone buzzed again, and this time the screen filled with a video call request from my parents. I let it ring unanswered. Seconds later, a text appeared. "Pick up." I ignored it. Another message followed. "Stop making this harder than it needs to be." Then another message followed. "Stop making this harder than it needs to be." I stopped the recording halfway through and dropped the phone on the bed. The anger rising in me felt electric, but it also brought clarity. They were already rewriting the narrative to make themselves the rescuers and me the obstacle. If I wanted the truth to survive, I needed facts that couldn't be twisted. I reopened my laptop and pulled up the real estate listing for my penthouse. Something about the numbers nagged at me, and now I understood why. The sale price was far below market value, almost offensively low. A place in Pacific Harbor Tower could never sell that quickly for that amount unless someone forced it through with unusual urgency. My parents had rushed it because they were desperate. The buyer's contact information appeared on the screen after a few clicks. I hesitated, then dialed. The man answered after several rings. His voice was cautious but polite. "Hello?" I took a breath and said, "This is Claire Bennett. I believe you purchased my penthouse." There was a pause long enough that I wondered if he might hang up. Instead, he exhaled slowly and replied, "We were wondering when you'd call." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Your parents told us you approved everything," he explained. "But they were extremely pushy. They said you were emotionally unstable and couldn't handle the process yourself." The words hit me like a slap. "Do you still have the emails?" I asked quietly. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "We saved everything. If you need them for legal reasons, we'll cooperate." When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long moment. My parents hadn't just taken my home. They had smeared my sanity to justify doing it. I immediately forwarded the information to Victoria along with a short message, "Buyers willing to testify." Her reply arrived seconds later. "Excellent. This strengthens our case. Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow we begin." But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake long past midnight, staring at the ceiling while the city noise filtered through the thin walls. Every memory of my family played through my head alongside the evidence I had just uncovered. Beneath the shock and grief, something else was growing stronger with each passing hour. They believed I would stay silent the way I always had. They believed guilt would keep me obedient. What they didn't understand was that the moment I saw my life boxed up on that sidewalk, something inside me had changed. By the time dawn crept across the motel window, I knew with absolute certainty that the war they had started was one I was finally ready to fight. The sky was still dim when I walked into Victoria Hayes's office the next morning, the lobby lights reflecting off the polished floor, as if the entire building were holding its breath. I carried a cardboard cup of motel coffee that had long since gone lukewarm, but I held it anyway because it gave my hands something to do. Victoria was already waiting in a glass-walled conference room, a stack of files arranged with the kind of precise order that suggested she had been awake far longer than I had. When she saw me, she gave a small, assessing nod and said quietly, "You look like you slept about 2 hours." I set the coffee down and answered honestly, "I slept 0. She didn't react with sympathy, only practicality. "Good," she replied. "Anger keeps people honest. Sit." I lowered myself into the chair across from her as she slid a thick binder across the table. Inside were copies of documents I recognized from my own files mixed with new pages she must have obtained overnight. "Here's where we stand," she said calmly. "Your parents used a restricted medical power of attorney and forged an update to expand it. They rushed a property sale without your consent and misrepresented your mental state to the buyers. On top of that, we now have preliminary evidence of financial transfers from your accounts." My stomach tightened at the words. "How much?" I asked quietly. Victoria hesitated, just long enough to tell me the number would hurt. "At least $70,000, she said finally. "Most of it tied to gambling platforms and predatory loans connected to your sister." The room felt smaller after that sentence. I stared at the documents in front of me, trying to reconcile the Sophie I had grown up protecting with the person described by the financial records. "I would have helped," I murmured, "if they had asked." Victoria leaned forward, folding her hands together. "That's exactly why they didn't ask," she said. "If they approached you honestly, you would have set boundaries, conditions, deadlines. They didn't want limits, they wanted control." The clarity of her explanation settled heavily over me. My parents hadn't come to me because they knew I would eventually say no. It had been easier to remove my choice entirely. She tapped another document, and the screen on the wall behind her lit up with a screenshot of a message thread between my parents and the realtor handling the sale. My eyes scanned the text slowly. "She won't question the paperwork. She travels constantly." Another message followed beneath it. "Claire is too emotional to deal with legal matters." Then another. "She doesn't need a place like that anyway." I felt my chest tighten. "That's not just manipulation," I whispered. "That's character assassination." Victoria nodded. "They built a narrative where you were unstable so they could justify taking control of your assets. And because you've spent years allowing them to dismiss your concerns as dramatic, they assumed no one would question it." For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just looked at the glowing screen and thought about every argument that had ended with me apologizing simply to restore peace. Every time I had swallowed my frustration because my parents insisted I was overreacting. It wasn't random. It had been preparation. Condition, because my parents insisted I was overreacting. It wasn't random. It had been preparation. Conditioning. When I finally looked up again, my voice felt steadier than I expected. "What happens now?" I asked. Victoria clicked a pen thoughtfully against the binder. "First, we file for an emergency injunction," she said. "That freezes the funds from the sale and stops them from moving anything else. Then we begin building a fraud case. But before we go further, there's something you need to understand." She paused and held my gaze until I met it fully. "They will accuse you of betrayal. They will cry. They will accuse you of betrayal. They will cry. They will accuse you of betrayal. They will cry. They will say you are tearing the family apart. They will blame Sophie's addiction and insist you're responsible for saving her. You have to stay silent through all of it. Let me handle the legal fire while you hold the truth." I nodded slowly. "I can do that." She slid a document toward me and placed a pen beside it. "This authorizes me to represent you fully," she explained. "Once you sign, your parents can't contact you about the case without going through me." My hand hovered above the page for a second, not from hesitation but from the realization that this moment marked a permanent shift in my life. For 30 years, I had moved within the gravitational pull of my family's expectations. Now I was stepping outside it. I signed my name. Victoria gathered the papers and began outlining the next steps with efficient precision. "Go back to the motel and rest," she instructed. "Tomorrow morning we file the injunction." I stood and slipped my coat on, feeling the strange weight of determination settle where fear had been the day before. Just as I reached the door, my phone buzzed with a new message. Sophie's name flashed across the screen. The text contained only 2 words: "Stop this." I looked at the message for a moment before locking the phone and sliding it back into my pocket. Victoria watched me carefully. "It's starting," I said quietly. She gave a faint, confident smile. "Let it," she replied. "You're not the one who should be scared." Outside the building, the morning sun was just beginning to climb over the skyline. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air and realizing that the shame I had carried for years no longer felt like mine. My parents and my sister had broken something that day on the sidewalk outside my building, but they hadn't broken me. What they had actually destroyed was the obedient daughter who always stepped aside to keep the peace. In her place stood someone they had never truly met before, and the woman who was about to walk into court was not someone they could control anymore. The courthouse hallway buzzed with the low murmur of lawyers, clerks, and strangers waiting for their own battles to begin when Victoria and I arrived the following morning a little before 9 a.m. The fluorescent lights above us cast everything in a pale, flat glow that made faces look tired and tense. I clutched the folder of documents against my chest even though Victoria already carried identical copies in her briefcase. It was less about necessity and more about the reassurance of holding proof that what had happened to me was real. As we walked toward the courtroom, my phone vibrated again with another message from my mother. "Claire, stop this before it goes too far." A second message from my father followed immediately after. "Family issues should not be handled in court." Then Sophie added her own contribution. Nice job humiliating everyone. I read the texts without responding and slid the phone back into my bag. Their words no longer stirred the same reflexive guilt. They felt smaller now, like echoes of a tactic that had already failed. Victoria slowed her steps, slightly, and glanced at me. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. I considered the question honestly before answering. "Focused," I said, "and angry." She gave a short honestly before answering. "Focused," I said, "and angry." She gave a short nod. "Good. Just remember that anger doesn't belong in the courtroom. Facts do." The double doors ahead of us swung open as the bailiff called for the parties involved in our hearing. My parents were already inside the hallway, standing together as if they were attending a solemn ceremony rather than defending themselves against a fraud accusation. My mother spotted me first. Her face tightened and she stepped forward with the quick, determined walk she used when she was about to lecture someone. "Claire," she said sharply, "we need to talk." Victoria moved subtly between us before I could respond. "No," she said sharply, "we need to talk." Victoria moved subtly between us before I could respond. "No," she said with professional firmness, "you do not." My father's eyes narrowed as he pointed a finger toward me. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "You don't sue your own family." I met his gaze calmly. "You don't sue your own family." I met his gaze calmly. "You don't steal from your daughter," I replied. Sophie stood a few feet away, leaning against the wall, scrolling through her phone as if the entire situation bored her. When she looked up, her expression carried that same careless annoyance she had shown during our call the day before. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "You're blowing everything out of proportion." I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I looked past her to the courtroom doors where the bailiff was signaling us to enter. The hearing room itself felt cooler than the hallway, the air conditioning humming softly as people settled into their seats. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, stepped onto the bench a few moments later and began scanning the documents placed before her. Victoria rose first when the judge invited opening statements. Her voice carried across the room with calm precision as she explained that my parents and sister had used a forged update to a medical power of attorney to authorize the sale of my penthouse without my knowledge. She described how they had misrepresented my mental state to the buyers and transferred the sale proceeds into accounts I never approved. Every sentence she spoke felt like a brick placed carefully into the buyers and transferred the sale proceeds into accounts I never approved. Every sentence she spoke felt like a brick placed carefully into the foundation of a case that would either rebuild my life or confirm its destruction. When she finished, my father's attorney stood and attempted to soften the situation with a thin smile. "Your Honor," he began, "this appears to be a family disagreement that has unfortunately escalated." The judge's expression did not change. Did the defendant sign the plaintiff's agreement that has unfortunately escalated? The judge's expression did not change. "Did the defendants sign the plaintiff's name to legal documents?" she asked directly. The lawyer hesitated just long enough to answer the question without actually answering it. They believed they had the authority. "That was not my question," the judge interrupted. The silence that followed stretched across the room like a held breath. My parents shifted uneasily in their seats. Sophie's phone screen went dark in her hands. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Until this court determines otherwise, the evidence suggests the sale may have occurred without proper authorization," she said. "Therefore, I am granting the emergency injunction requested by the plaintiff. All accounts associated with the property sale are to be frozen immediately." My mother let out a strangled gasp as if someone had physically struck her. My father pushed himself halfway out of his chair before the judge's stern gaze forced him back down. The gavel struck the desk with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. For a moment, I couldn't move. The ruling wasn't a final victory, but it was the first real confirmation that I wasn't powerless. Victoria leaned slightly toward me and murmured, "That's step one." My parents surged toward us the second the judge exited the courtroom. My mother's eyes were red with anger and disbelief. "How could you do this?" she demanded. "We needed that money." I held her gaze calmly and said, "It came from my home." Sophie scoffed loudly. "You're acting like this makes you some kind of hero," she said. "You're just selfish." I felt an odd sense of distance from her now, as if I were observing a stranger rather than the girl I had once helped with homework and broken hearts. "Maybe," I replied quietly, "but at least I'm done being useful." Victoria guided me toward the exit before the argument could grow louder. The moment we stepped outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt brighter than it had that morning. Cars moved steadily along the street, and people passed by without the slightest awareness that something inside me had shifted. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the movers appeared outside my building, I felt the balance beginning to tilt. The life my family tried to take from me wasn't gone. It was waiting on the other side of the battle they had forced me to fight. 6 weeks later, the courthouse felt familiar in a way I never imagined it would. The marble floors, the quiet echo of footsteps, even the smell of paper and coffee had become part of the strange routine my life had turned into while the case moved toward trial. Each week had uncovered more details than the last. Victoria and her team had traced months of withdrawals from my accounts, small enough to avoid triggering alarms but steady enough to accumulate into a devastating pattern. Dr. Malcolm Hale had finished his forensic report, confirming that the signature on the sale contract was traced letter by letter. The financial investigator had uncovered hidden accounts linked to Sophie's gambling debts and loan agreements that my parents had quietly tried to repay using my money. Piece by piece, the story that had once sounded unbelievable became impossible to deny. On the morning of the trial, the sky hung low with gray clouds as Victoria pulled her car into the courthouse parking lot just after 8 a.m. She turned off the engine and studied my face for a moment before speaking. "You're calmer than you were at the injunction hearing," she said. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap and realized she was right. The shaking that had filled my body weeks earlier had disappeared. "That was anger," I told her. "Today feels different." She gave a faint approving smile. "Good. Today you let the evidence speak." When we walked through the courthouse doors, the hallway was already busy with reporters, lawyers, and spectators drawn by the drama of a family fraud case that had quietly attracted attention. My parents stood near the courtroom entrance dressed in conservative clothes that made them look more like victims than defendants. Sophie lingered behind them, her expression tight and restless. The trial began with opening statements. Victoria laid out the facts with careful clarity, describing how my parents had used a forged update to a medical power of attorney to execute the sale of my penthouse while I was out of state. She explained the misrepresentation of my mental competence, the unauthorized financial transfers, and the deliberate rush of the sale. When she presented the enlarged images of the forged signature, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. My parents' attorney tried to frame the situation as a misunderstanding born from desperation, but every attempt to soften the story faltered under the weight of the evidence. The judge listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes while the jury watched the exchange with growing focus. When it was my turn to testify, walking to the witness stand felt like crossing an invisible threshold. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat facing the courtroom where strangers now knew intimate details about my life. Victoria asked me to describe the day I returned from Hawaii and found movers outside my building. As I spoke, the memories came back with startling clarity. The boxes stacked on the sidewalk, the message from my mother telling me not to be dramatic, the moment I realized my family had decided my home was theirs to sacrifice. I kept my voice steady, even when the defense attorney tried to suggest that my anger had clouded my memory. "I remember exactly what happened," I told him calmly, "because it changed my life." The next witnesses built the case piece by piece. Dr. Hale explained to the jury how the forged signature showed clear signs of tracing under magnification. A financial analyst walked through the transfers from my accounts, highlighting the pattern that had quietly drained tens of thousands of dollars over months. Ethan and Lauren Parker, the buyers who had unknowingly purchased my penthouse, testified that my parents insisted I was emotionally unstable and unable to participate in the sale process. Each statement added another layer to the story, until the defense's argument of misunderstanding felt increasingly hollow. Then my mother took the stand. She began crying before she even finished taking the oath. Through tears, she described how worried they had been about Sophie's debt and how they believed I would eventually understand. But when the judge asked directly whether she had signed my name on the property documents, the room went silent. My mother hesitated only a moment before answering in a trembling voice, "I signed it because Claire would have said no." The admission hung in the air like a shockwave. Sophie's testimony followed and carried less regret than resentment. She complained that I had always acted superior because of my career, and that the penthouse was wasted on someone who lived alone. The words sounded harsher spoken aloud in a courtroom than they ever had in private arguments. By the time my father testified, the defense had little ground left to stand on. He attempted to frame their actions as family sacrifice, arguing that everything they did was meant to protect Sophie. The judge's patience thinned as she reminded him repeatedly that protecting one child did not grant permission to defraud another. When the day finally ended and the jury filed out to deliberate, Victoria leaned close and whispered, "That was decisive." I sat quietly at the table, letting the tension drain slowly from my shoulders. The verdict would arrive the next morning, but something inside me already knew the truth had finally been heard. The morning of the verdict arrived with a strange stillness that made every sound feel sharper. I woke before 6 a.m. in the motel room that had once felt like a temporary refuge and now felt like the last remnant of a life already behind me. The pale gray light of early morning filtered through the thin curtains, and for a few quiet minutes, I simply sat on the edge of the bed breathing slowly, reminding myself that whatever happened in that courtroom would not erase the strength it had taken to reach this point. By 8 a.m., Victoria was waiting outside, leaning against her car with a travel mug in her hand. She offered a brief smile when I approached and said, "Today we find out how this chapter ends." I nodded and climbed into the passenger seat, feeling the same quiet resolve that had carried me through the trial. The courthouse hallway felt even more crowded than the day before. Word of the case had spread, and curious onlookers lingered near the courtroom doors hoping to witness the conclusion. My parents were already there. My mother sat rigidly on a bench, her hands clasped so tightly they had gone pale. My father stood beside her with his jaw set in a stubborn line, while Sophie lingered near the wall staring at the floor. When they saw me approach, my mother stood quickly and whispered my name. "Claire, please." I shook my head gently. Not now. The single refusal seemed to drain what little confidence she had left, and she sat back down without another word. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavy with anticipation. The jury filed in first, their expressions carefully neutral as they took their seats. When the judge entered, everyone rose automatically. My heart pounded in my chest as she addressed the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreperson stood and answered, "Yes, Your Honor." The silence that followed felt endless. When she began reading the decision, each sentence struck with the weight of a hammer. In the matter of fraud, the jury found in favor of the plaintiff. In the matter of forgery, they again ruled in my favor. In the misuse of power of attorney, they ruled the same way. My mother's quiet sob broke through the stillness as the verdict continued. The judge then summarized the court's decision with calm authority. The sale of my penthouse was declared null and void, restoring ownership to me immediately. All funds taken from my accounts were to be returned, along with damages totaling $100,000 to compensate for emotional harm, legal fees, and the loss of use of my property. Sophie whispered in disbelief that they could never repay that amount, but the judge responded without hesitation that consequences do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. When my father tried to argue that families should not sue one another, the judge's answer was firm and unmistakable. "Families also do not steal from one another," she said. When the gavel struck, the room filled with murmurs as people began standing and gathering their things. My mother approached me again, tears streaking down her face. "Claire, we'll lose the house," she said desperately. "We'll lose everything." I held her gaze with a calm I never imagined I would possess in a moment like this. "You lost those things when you chose to betray me," I said quietly. Sophie grabbed my arm then, her voice trembling with panic. "They said there could be criminal charges," she whispered. "You can stop this." I gently pulled my arm away. "You created this," I replied. I just stopped protecting you from it." My father said nothing at first, but as I turned to leave, he muttered bitterly that I was no daughter of his. I paused only long enough to answer softly that he had stopped being my father the moment he decided my life belonged to him. Outside the courthouse, the clouds had begun to break apart, sunlight spilling across the wide stone steps. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth settle on my face while the tension of the past months finally began to release its grip. Victoria stepped beside me and said, "You fought for yourself, and you won." The words felt unreal at first, but slowly they sank in. My home was mine again. My finances were safe. And perhaps most importantly, the invisible chains of obligation that had tied me to my family's demands had finally been broken. 2 days later, a moving truck parked outside my building once more, but this time the sight did not fill me with dread. I rode the elevator to the top floor and stepped into the penthouse that had once felt lost forever. The rooms were quiet and sunlit, the windows stretching across the skyline exactly as I remembered. As the movers carried my furniture back inside piece by piece, the space slowly filled with familiar details that reminded me who I had been before everything collapsed. When the last box was unpacked and the door closed behind the final mover, silence settled into the apartment like a gentle promise. That evening, I stood on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker on beneath the fading sunset. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother that read simply, "I hope you're okay." I did not reply. Maybe one day I would, but not yet. Healing, I realized, required space as much as forgiveness. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared above the skyline, I felt something inside me finally relax. I had fought for my home, my independence, and the right to define my life on my own terms. The victory was not just about reclaiming a penthouse. It was about reclaiming the boundaries that should never have been crossed in the first place. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to stand up for your own peace even when it meant confronting the people closest to you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your voice and your experiences matter, and sharing them might remind someone else that they are not alone. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to the channel for more stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet courage it takes to protect your own life. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember that sometimes the strongest act of love you can offer yourself is the courage to say no.